New pig bag, by Pig Bag, at the opening credit there, at the opening of the show. What on earth is a pig bag?
I have absolutely no idea. Well, I expected something very nice.
I have absolutely no idea. But I was actually thinking to myself, you know, I've been doing this show, and like I just said, and other shows for about 6 odd years now. I've never played that before, and what a track! Absolutely wonderful stuff. This is me, Dave Roberts, on the fantastic Meridian 107 FM, and tonight Derek's here, as you've just heard, and we always pick a subject. We do something, a record label, you know, a person, a song, an album, something like that. Tonight we're doing guitar heroes. Now Robert's written in, and he said. Dave, he said, I hope you've got Rory Gallagher in there somewhere. And I'm going to leave it to you, Derek, to sort of disappoint Robert completely now, because we haven't got Rory Gallagher in there. We're not belittling or putting down Rory Gallagher in the slightest. He's an absolute master guitarist, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
But you'll be surprised, we haven't actually got Hendrix in there either.
That's right.
Just tonight. And there is a reason for this.
Yeah, I mean, particularly Hendrix, he needs a whole show of himself. But what tonight's about really is three specific guitar heroes, guitar legends: B.B. King, Chuck Berry, and Eric Clapton. I mean, B.B. King kicked off in the 50s, Chuck Berry in the 60s, and in the 50s, B.B. King in the 40s, Chuck Berry in the 50s, and Clapton in the 60s.
So what we're going to do for people like Robert and other people listening who are expecting a kind of a whole plethora of guitars, you know, of guitar heroes, you know, sort of Page and Steve Howe and Stevie Ray Vaughan, Jeff Baxter, Scotty Moore, anyone like that. What we're probably going to do at another stage is perhaps do a Guitar Heroes Part 2.
Absolutely.
And we're going to do obviously, I think Hendrix is probably going to get a slot of his own.
Absolutely, he must
because he just warrants it because of who he is. And then the rest, we'll probably do a whole show.
That'd be great.
And include perhaps, I don't know, go up to about 8 or 9, 10 different guitarists.
Absolutely. Just look at the history of the guitar hero.
We will have a guitar fest.
Burt Whedon will be there.
The wonderful Playing a Day Burt Whedon. You can't go wrong, can you?
Exactly.
We all tried and all failed. But anyway,
whole generation of guitarists started with Playing
Derek,
a Day.
It's wonderful to see you again. It's lovely when you come in once a month. And like I say, we're doing the Guitar Heroes. We got 3, and over to you. And you'll be surprised, dear listener, what Derek's going to come up with tonight.
Yeah, it's very much starts with a look at B.B. King. Somebody who is very well known because of people like Eric Clapton. But just thinking about it with Hendrix and the other guy whose name's just escaped me.
Oh,
Rory Gallagher. Rory Gallagher. Hendrix was once asked, what's it feel like to be the best guitarist in the world? And his reply was, you better ask Rory Gallagher. Oh. Which I thought was very
wonderful.
nice.
Wonderful.
Quick mental block on the name Gallagher, but there you go.
Yeah.
Back to B.B. King. I mean, he very much came to fame on the back of the blues revival, but he was very much one of the first real guitar heroes come out of the blues. He had 68 singles on the Billboard Top 40 R&B chart. B.B. King, between the first one in 51 and then up to about 85. But what's interesting, he ever had 2 hit singles in the UK, and neither were really because of him. One was because he appeared on a track on When Love Comes to Town on U2's Rattle and Hum in 1989, and he did a gig with Gary Moore as well in 1992. But, I mean, he started back. Born Riley King in 1925 in Itabena, Mississippi. Moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1947, and was influenced by people like Blind Lemon Jefferson and T-Bone Walker. The origin of BB's interesting. It came about in the late 40s when he worked as a DJ on WDIA in Memphis, and he started out being called Beale Street Blues Boy, and that got shortened to Blues Boy King, and that eventually found its way to being just B.B. King. And also interesting because he had a name. He called all of his guitars, his Gibson trademark guitars, Lucille, and that comes after a night he was playing a gig in Twist Arkansas, and a fight broke out. And the kerosene lamp was knocked over, started a fire, and everybody rushed out. And he rushed out with everybody else. And they thought, my guitar's inside. So he rushed back in and rescued his guitar.
But who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? I would.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just as well he wasn't a drummer. That's all I can say. That's why the harmonica is such a wonderful instrument. You can run away with it in your pocket. But he decided then that he found out the fight was over a lady named Lucille, and he decided to call his guitar Lucille as a reminder never to do a crazy thing like fight over a woman. And that stayed with his guitars for the rest of his life. And he kicked off in 1949 with his first recording on the Bullet label, in a series of Bullets. But then he moved over to RPM. And he started his string of hits on Billboard with 3 O'Clock Blues, and that spent 3 weeks at number one. And he was then, this is now the 50s, long before he was famous, certainly over here. And he was playing on what they used to refer to as the chitlin circuit, the juke joints and bars, particularly around the South. But it was very much the 60s where he came to prominence, and he was very much a hero of people like Eric Clapton. It was through them that he really started to make a name for himself. And in 1968 he was at the Newport Folk Festival, and there's a superb album of that, if anybody's manages to hunt that down. He supported the Stones on their famous 1969 tour in America.
Did you ever see BB?
No, I didn't actually.
I saw him at, I think it was the Fairfield Halls in Croydon.
Oh, brilliant.
And very good, very good. The only thing I can really remember, it was a few years ago now, the only thing I can remember about it was he'd just come back, he was either going to or just come from Norwich. And being where he comes from, he said, I'm going to Norwich.
Right.
And some wag in the audience just shouted out, Norwich, kind of thing.
Yeah.
To which he instantly, I mean, it just rolled off the tongue. It was so quick. He just said, hey, he said, I'm from Mississippi. I'll teach you how to talk. Excellent, excellent. Brilliant stuff.
Yeah. No, sadly, he was one of the people I didn't quite manage to see. A bit late now. And he came over in 71 and toured the UK. And he played Glastonbury. Even B.B. King has played Glastonbury. That was in 2011. And he died, actually, in 2015. And Clapton was doing his 17th run at the Albert Hall. And on the 15th of May, the following day, was his 200th performance at the Albert Hall. And he dedicated that to B.B. King. And I think one of the songs that's well worth listening to, Every Day I Have the Blues. And that was, it was a song that originally, well, not necessarily originally, but because a lot of these blues songs go way back and they get reworked. But one of the first ones really credited is Pine Top. Version 1935, and Memphis Slim had a famous reworking of that, and he called his 1949 version Nobody Loves Me. But Every Day I Have the Blues is B.B. King's theme song.
B.B. King and Every Day I Have the Blues. From 1955, believe it or not. B.B. King there, and Every Day I Have the Blues. Before we move on, Derek, his voice, it was just so unbelievably unique. I mean, the minute he says anything, you just say B.B. King.
Absolutely.
You can't confuse him with anyone or anything, can you?
Very distinctive style.
Have you any idea where it came from? Was he a heavy smoker or something?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah.
But I mean, the guy's interesting because not only has he got a very recognisable, brilliant voice, he's also very highly rated as a guitarist. Rolling Stone magazine, in their 100 best guitarists of all time, I think put him at number 3, which is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah.
But the other thing about him is it's his whole range of the blues. He just doesn't sing about, and the dog's died and the wife's left me kind of songs. He does all that big band stuff as well.
Yeah,
absolutely amazing.
But for a great guitarist, I actually read an interview with him once, and he said he doesn't really play chords. If you listen to him, I mean, he does play them, but I think he was saying that his fingers were quite fat and not good for sort of multiple, obviously doing a chord, but great for lead guitar and very powerful hands as well. And just
well, he's a big lad.
He was a big chap. Yes. Yeah. We're going to move on now. Who are we going to do now?
Well, I thought Chuck Berry would be a good choice. Looking at guitar heroes, because I mean, Chuck Berry was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in its inaugural session in 1986. So, along with Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, the Everly Brothers, Alan Freed, and the like, I mean, he was there. And John Lennon, not talking to the Beatles, it took them 3 years before the first British act, the Beatles, went into the American Hall of Fame. But he was on the Mike Douglas show in 1972 and actually performed with Chuck Berry. And it was there that he made the famous quote that if you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry. So, Chuck Berry's credentials are second to none, really. And if you look at the Stones' first half a dozen albums, an awful lot of covers on them, because that's how life was then. Awful lot of those covers are Chuck Berry covers. The Beatles covered quite a few Chuck Berry songs. In fact, we'll find out later that he got them into some litigation with said Chuck Berry when they fell foul of being a little bit too close to one of Chuck Berry's songs. I mean, Berry was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1926, October the 18th. Happy birthday. And his full name was Chuck Edward Anderson Berry. Excuse me. And sometimes he used the name E. Anderson on his records as the writing credit. So if you see any Chuck Berry songs you thought were written by Chuck Berry, and it says the E. Anderson, you were absolutely right the first time around. But like a lot of rock and roll legends, like J. Lee Lewis, quite a checkered history. Chuck Berry has a checkered history. In 1944, he served his first prison term, and that was for armed robbery. This was not a trivial thing. Apparently, he and a couple of mates held up 2 or 3 stores and then stole a car at gunpoint. Then he spent 2.5 years. Came out of jail in 1947 on his 21st birthday, which I thought was pretty sweet. Yeah,
not a bad present, really, when you think about it, is it?
Yeah, exactly. He did have more trips to prison later, but I thought we'd keep them in context of what he was doing at the time. But for any record collectors out there, the first recording he ever made was with a band called Joe Alexander and the Cubans. I hope these words will find you well, and Oh Maria. And I haven't managed to track down I Hope These Words anywhere, but I was listening to Oh Maria a couple of days ago, and as you can imagine, with a name like Joe Alexander and the Cuban, it's a very, very Latin song. And that was 1954 he was doing that. It wasn't until he joined Chess in 1955 that he recorded his first single himself, Maybelline, which was actually based on Bob Wills' 38 recording of Ida Red. It's interesting with a lot of these songs how, even with Chuck Berry, who's a major songwriter, he was reworking. Carl Perkins reworked. A lot of the stuff Carl Perkins claims for the writing credit for actually go back to other people. And a lot of the blues songs that are credited also go back a lot earlier. And the fact that they're reworked tends to allow them to copyright them. But Berry's Duck Walk arrived around the same sort of time. He was very famous. Everybody almost certainly will have seen Chuck Berry on old TV programs and concerts when he sort of gets down, crouches on his knees and then duck walks across the stage. And that came into being around 55 at an Alan Freed concert. Pretty much just before he recorded Johnny Be Good, 58, Around and Around. And with Johnny Be Good, he liked that story so much that he actually created a couple of other songs, Bye Bye Johnny and Go Go Go, which were all centered around this Johnny Be Good character. So he obviously liked that.
Looking at Around and Around, it was Bowie did that.
Yeah.
And it's just fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
It was the B-side of Driving Saturday, I think.
Yeah, I can't remember.
I think so. Yeah. I think it was, and I used to play that. I used to play around and around more than I did Drive-In Saturday. Because I mean, when Mick Ronson's guitar starts going, it's just wonderful, wonderful. Sidetracking slightly, dear listener, but if you've never heard, and Bowie calls it Round and Round. I don't think he calls it Around and Round. But if you've never heard Round and Round by Bowie, I'm sure it's the B-side of Drive-In Saturday. Just look it up on Spotify or something, and turn everything up, get the bass going a little bit, and dance around the room to it, because it's just wonderful. That's what I used to do as a kid all the time. It was just wonderful.
Perfect.
Just wonderful.
But it's great how the songs from the 50s and early 60s lend themselves beautifully to reinterpreting when you've got someone like Mick Ronson playing guitar, because the guitar styles changed quite dramatically by the time you got to then. The Go 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 as well was interesting, because when it was released in America, it had Come On the B-side, and of course Come On was then re-recorded by the Stones as their first UK hit single. That's one of my favourite Stones. I always remember hearing that. It reminds me because when I was brought up, we were going to Butlins for a week. I'd be, 15 or something. And we were going with my best friend at the time, Barry Ashbrook. Barry, where are you now? And I can always remember it was on the radio.
Perhaps he's written a book called Rock'n'Roll Unravelled as well. You never know.
You never know.
You had the same roots.
Yeah, well, he certainly had the haircut. He was blonde and had it in a crew cut style. And he was far too good looking for his own good. He had no problem with the ladies. But, I mean, it's this sort of time. I mean, Alan Freed is very much the man of the moment. Alan Freed is the American DJ who coined the phrase rock and roll. But he had this tour that featured Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry. Now, Chuck Berry was the better known of the two artists, but at the time, Jerry Lee Lewis had 2 or 3 really, really big hits, Great Balls of Fire and the like. And they argued very much about who should go on first. And Chuck Berry, who should go on first in the sense of topping the bill. And Chuck Berry persuaded Alan Freed that, he was the hero. He should go on last. So Chuck Berry went on before. Jerry Lewis went on before Chuck Berry. And Jerry Lee Lewis decided that he would show Chuck Berry what a stage act was all about. So what he did, he set fire to his piano. And again, anybody seen old television stuff and concert stuff of Jerry Lewis, he would stand on his piano, he would play with his feet. He was a wild man of rock and roll. And he gave a storming, piano burning performance. And as he walked off, he reputedly, as he passed Chuck Berry in the wings, he said words to the effect of, "Follow that," which Chuck Berry would have done, but my money's on Jerry Lee Lewis as Mr. Excitement that night. But that was the time then, a couple of years later, 62, when he went to prison for the second time. Another sort of 3-year drill search. This time it was for violating the Mann Act. If you're not familiar with the Mann Act in America, it's a legislation that was passed so that it's illegal to take a minor over the state line for naughty purposes. And he'd formed a relationship with a young lady, and he fell foul of the Mann Act, and he spent his second time in jail. But by then, his career really was starting to motor. But the whole plagiarism thing's interesting. I mean, Led Zeppelin found themselves being hit with a plagiarism charge in recent times. But, I mean, it's been going in rock and roll forever. And the Beach Boys recorded Surfing USA, and the great Mr. Wilson took the credit for that. But Chuck Berry took a very dim view of that because he considered it was a little too close to his 1958 single of Sweet Little 16. So he started proceedings against the Beach Boys, and you'll find if you've got some very original covers of that, very original versions of that, it'll be credited to Wilson, and later ones are credited jointly with Chuck Berry. And the Beatles, Paul McCartney famously talks about the time that when they recorded I Saw Her Standing There, he actually borrowed a bass line rather than plagiarised a bass line from Berry's.
I mean, do you know the difference?
Well, I think the difference is what one you get sued for, and the other one, it was decided that it was a nice thing to do.
So Mr. Berry still didn't get a credit?
No, he never got a credit for that. But I mean, by the time this would have all come to light, I mean, the Beatles were the Beatles, and suing the Beatles would not probably be the smartest thing in the history of the world. And flattery, copying is the greatest form of imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And to have one of your songs, Berry's 1961 single "I'm Talking About You," the bass guitar, to inspire that, I think was good. And I think it might be different in terms of it was more that it was the sort of shape of the guitar work rather than lifting lyrics or lifting licks. But I mean, the Beatles were happy enough. He was well happy enough, and that comes from McCartney himself. He's been quoted a few times in interviews as saying that. So it's pretty much there, I think. And he came over to the UK for the first time in 1964. So I mean, American audiences have been seeing Berry for a decade before he came over to Britain. But it's interesting if you look at the timing of that. The Americans dominated the 50s, and the beat thing started in the early 60s, and by the middle 60s, 64, you get to the British invasion, and it was very much on the back of all the various covers that British audiences got to know about the Americans, and that's when people like B.B. King and particularly people like Chuck Berry started to really come to the fore over in the UK. And he also supported the Stones in 1969. That was the tour when the fateful Altamont concert finished the proceedings. I think it was the 6th of December.
Ironic that, isn't it? Chuck Berry supporting the Stones. I mean, the Stones wouldn't be here without Chuck Berry. It's a bit weird, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm. But I think that's very much the nature of the beast. A lot of the blues revival and the real fame that a lot of these American blues artists got outside of the R&B charts in America was because of the blues revival in the early and middle 60s. Not just British groups. You got Creedence Clearwater and loads of other American bands that covered lots of good blues stuff. And then of course the Beatles recorded "Come Together" as the B-side of "Something." And they more than borrowed "You Can't Catch Me," a Chuck Berry single in 1956. Some of the words were rather too similar. And later, Chuck Berry in 75, that was 69, 75, Chuck Berry went and sued them. Well, his manager did technically, or the copyright holder of the music, the guy who bought the music by then. And it was all settled with John Lennon's Rock'n'Roll album. When he agreed that he'd add some Chuck Berry songs to the Rock'n'Roll album in 75, and he added two, Sweet Little 16 and You Can't Catch Me, which was the Berry single that he'd effectively the Beatles had, or Lennon had plagiarised on "Come Together." And really, just before sort of listening to that, it's worth just noting that a little bit after that, the end of the 70s, saw Chuck Berry go into prison for the third time. But this is for the more bourgeois, grown-up offence of tax evasion.
We've all done it. We've all done it. God, dear, the time's absolutely flying by. It's nearly 8:45 already. We've got another guitar hero to get through. Let's get a bit of Chuck Berry going, and thankfully, because it's Chuck Berry, the song only lasts 2 minutes and 43 seconds. This is the aforementioned Chuck Berry, and You Can't Catch Me. You just never know that was Chuck Berry, would you?
Quite a distinctive style.
It's just Chuck Berry. He said he's gone around and he said, "Look, I've invented this style, and I'm sticking with it."
Yeah. And it suits him.
Except for when he wants to do something like My Ding-a-Ling.
Exactly. Yeah, it's quite ironic.
Which was probably his best-selling single, wasn't it?
Was. I think it was.
Ridiculous.
I mean, quite sad, really.
The great Chuck Berry. We're going to move on now. Slightly more up-to-date, but not too far.
That's right. Yeah, we're moving now into somebody who came to the fore in the 60s. I mean, to call him a legend is an understatement. I mean, Eric Clapton, the only man to have gone into the American Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 times. in his own right in 2000, as the part of the Yardbirds in 92, and as part of Cream in 93. And to date, he is the only person with 3 of those gongs. He started out in the early 1963 in the Roosters with a friend of his, Ben Palmer, pianist, that isn't that well known, but does keep popping up in Eric Clapton's career. And actually, Tom McGuinness was also part of the Roosters, and his next band, Clapton's next band, Casey Jones and the Engineers, in the end of 63, September 63, reputedly only had about 7 gigs with them, and Clapton thought they were far too popified for him. He wanted more blues, so he joined the Yardbirds, replaced Top Topham. Actually,
whose daughter has been on this show.
Yeah.
Lee Nicolado.
Yeah.
Very good she was.
Yeah.
Excellent. Really good. Really good. Yeah. Sidetracking again, but please carry on.
Oh, life is full of little side avenues, really. If it wasn't for side avenues, we wouldn't know where the main road was.
We'd all be going down the straight line anyway, wouldn't we? Yes, carry on.
Get boring. But he was replaced by Jeff Beck. The last single he did with them, For Your Love, was really the last nail in the coffin with the Yardbirds. Once again, Clapton decided that he wanted more blues. But just the irony there before moving on was the B-side to that, Gotta Hurry, was Clapton's first recorded composition. So despite the fact that he hated the A-side, he actually scored his first royalties on the B-side. But he wanted more blues, so he joined John Mayall. Famously, he... a couple of months after joining John Mayall, he left temporarily to go off on the idea was to hitchhike to Australia, but they never got as far as Greece. And again, his mate Ben Palmer was with him on this jaunt. But when they got to Greece, they found themselves trapped in a nightclub because the owner found out they were working without permits and started to blackmail them effectively. And they reputedly did a midnight flit one night, and Clapton had to leave his amplifier behind. But they got back. He rejoined John Mayall. And the sad thing about that, well, for Pete Green, the sad thing was he'd only just joined Mayall when he was replaced by Clapton. They released the Beano album about around 66, Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton, and then set off to form Cream, actually formed by Ginger Baker, and it was Eric Clapton that insisted that Jack Bruce was the bass player because they played together in the Blues Breakers. Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce didn't get on, and Baker's reputedly pulled a knife on Bruce at one point and suggested it was time he moved on from the group that they were with then. But Cream together just over a couple of years, absolutely superb. In fact, it was the first of these sessions that we ever did was Cream. Very fond memories. But shortly after Cream split up in 68, the Rolling Stones did their rather strange rock and roll circus. Recorded on December the 11th, 1968. And that was John Lennon's band, and it had Keith Richard on bass and Mitch Mitchell, Jimi Hendrix's drummer, on that. But then it was Clapton decided that he wanted to form another group, and he formed the ill-fated Blind Faith with Ginger Baker, Steve Winwood, and Rick Gretsch. Now, they only had half a dozen, 6 months of gigs. They played the first one at Hyde Park in the summer, and they played their last one in Hawaii. Well, not even 6 months, more like 3 months in August. He'd become very disenchanted with the whole thing. They were called a supergroup, and it never really gathered the momentum it needed. So what Clapton decided to do after he'd famously gone over to Toronto with the Plastic Ono Band for the Rock'n'Roll Revival there, where they very famously had their own rehearsal on the plane on the way over. He decided that he'd join Delaney and Bonnie. Delaney and Bonnie had been the support act when Blind Faith toured America, and Clapton had often travelled with them in their tour bus. He'd often perform with them on stage. And when Blind Faith imploded, he actually joined Delaney and Bonnie. And they did do a live album because George Harrison decided that, I think he was in Bristol, I think he saw them, and he decided he really liked them, so he joined them for the rest of that tour, and they did a live album together, Delaney and Bonnie and Friends.
They had great track. I think I've played it, but I won't play it tonight, obviously. I must play it again, Going Home.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Fantastic track, absolutely brilliant. And Clapton singing on that is just excellent.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
It was, in fact, Delaney and Bonnie, or Delaney, I think, that persuaded Clapton that he should sing, because Clapton really felt, talking about blues singers and voices earlier with B.B. King, Clapton really didn't believe that he could sing at all. And it was his stint with Delaney and Bonnie that when he was persuaded to start to do more singing. Of course, eventually that's what he very much came into. Then he decided that he just wanted to be in a band. He didn't want to be a front man. He didn't want to be in a supergroup. He just wanted to stand at the back and play his guitar. So he formed Derek and the Dominoes, and they, Dwayne Elman famously guested on the album, Layla of the Assorted Love Songs. But Clapton's life was spinning now into drugs and all kinds of stuff that wasn't doing his career too much good. And the band fell apart when they were recording the second album. And by the end of 1970, Clapton had really gone into isolation, self-imposed seclusion. And this is all well documented in various biographies. And he went off and lived in his Surrey mansion. And various people tried to pull him out of this. There was George Harrison got him to go along to the concert for Bangladesh in the summer of 1971. But it was really Pete Townsend when he persuaded him to do the Rainbow concert. And this is now January 73, so this is a good couple of years on from that. And famously, he very nearly didn't appear at the Rainbow concert because his white trousers that he was wearing, he'd put so much weight on his stage trousers since he'd actually worn them that his good lady wife had to do a little bit of tipping and nicking to get them to fit. But he made the concert, and really that was where it all started to work for him again. And then by the time we get to 1974, he's got 461 Ocean Boulevard, and he was opening that tour in June, and he was back, and he was very much now a solo performer. And, very famously did a whole load of gigs at the Albert Hall. They varied. I think the first one was 6 or 8 nights. By the time you get sort of 10 years in, I think he was doing sort of 26, 28, 30. I can't remember the exact statistics for these, but they varied over the years. But absolutely phenomenal, the performances there.
Well, time's beaten us, Derek, but fantastic, as always. 3 really interesting guitarists. And as I said at the beginning, if you were expecting, your Pages and your Becks and all the others sort of thing, we're going to do them, but obviously not tonight. We just wanted to concentrate on those 3 tonight. But we will do a kind of like a Guitar Heroes Part 2.
Absolutely.
Because there's so many out there. And let's face it, if you're the lead guitarist or the main guitarist in a band, there's generally something about you that has brought you there. Yeah. There's some kind of story. There's, you're not normal, basically, are you?
Exactly.
You're just not normal.
And what we'll do is look at the various bands they were in and sort of start at the beginning and move towards the end.
Derek, as usual, it's been absolutely fantastic and fascinating. You'll be back again in about a month's time.
Yep.
Not sure when because of holidays and all that kind of stuff. But, we'll think of something. We might even do Guitar Heroes Part 2, or we might leave it 1 month and then just do it and then come back to it in sort of September, October time. But for now, Derek, thanks very much. And taking us up to the 9 o'clock news on the new 3-hour Music for Grown-Ups. What else? A bit of Clapton.